What's up, all you cool cats and kittens? This is my cat, Roosevelt. He's thrilled to be here with us, as you can see. Hey, Roosevelt, say hi to the children. So I guess this is bring your cat or pet to class day for me. There you go. This is my cat. He's a good cat. He's about 8 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. He is a Russian Blue, which is a breed of cat. Isn't it weird how people always know breeds of dogs, but they never know breeds of cats? Like, everyone's always like, oh, it's a boxer. Oh, it's a bulldog. Oh, it's a chihuahua. Oh, it's a German shepherd. But then when it's cats, it's like, hey, it's a cat. Hey, it's a cat. Hey, that's a cat. Look at that cat. Isn't that funny? Well, he is a cat, but he's also a cat breed called a Russian Blue. So here's your assignment. Find out, if you have a cat, what kind of cat you have. Because they have breeds too. I used to have a cat called a Chantilly. Look that up. Hey, what a crazy storm we had the other night. Am I right? That was nuts. That was Sunday night. You'll be getting this Tuesday, so Easter. What a crazy storm. It was like tornado. If you live in Reynolds, hopefully you don't have any damage to your house. Or if you live anywhere, really, I guess I hope you don't have damage to your house. A lot of trees down. Don't have any trees down here. I am outside. Look at this lovely trampoline. I'm outside, but yeah, we don't have any trees down. It's actually, we got spared a lot of the damage. So that's cool. But I saw that a lot of Reynolds got hit pretty hard. A lot of Rock Eagle area got hit pretty hard. So hopefully you guys are all safe and sound. But we're going to get back into it. We were talking about, last time we were talking about secession, leading up to secession, and then secession movement, Georgia withdrawing itself from the Union, Georgia leaving the United States of America, and that did, in fact, happen. And what we're going to talk about now is the actual chain of events that lead for the Civil War to happen. So we're in January of 1861. We're going to kind of move along through the year of 1861 to the point where fighting actually begins. And believe it or not, that actually takes a little bit of time. We tend to think of 1860, 1861 is kind of just being the beginning, but it actually goes, the beginning kind of stalls for a little bit. It goes into the summer and fall and then winter of 1861. So let's get back into it. As you guys left off last time, we were talking about old Jeff Davis here. And Jeff Davis, he was the guy who's elected president of the Confederacy, these states, these 11 states that all joined together to fight against Northern invasion, as they saw. It's a confederacy, and a confederacy, as we've been talking, is a loose union. It's not quite what the United States is. The United States is under a very formal union, federal republic. Whereas the Confederacy was a confederacy, meaning that Georgia could kind of pick and choose what it wanted to do, what it wanted to listen to, what it wanted to go along with. And this actually caused a lot of problems for the Confederacy during the war, is that the states did not necessarily have to listen to Jefferson Davis. This guy right here, the president, Joseph Brown, who's the governor of Georgia, a lot of times just says, I'm not going to listen to you. Right? He just says, nah, I'm not going to listen to what you want, Jeff Davis. I'm not going to listen to what you think we should do. I'm going to do what I think we should do. And other southern states are the same way during the Civil War, and it really becomes a problem for the South. And there's no unity among southern states, and there's no working together for the most part. Major problem. So Fort Sumter, if you've ever been to Charleston, maybe you've been to Charleston, South Carolina, maybe you've been to Fort Sumter. It's an island in the middle of Charleston Harbor, and it was designed to protect Charleston from invaders from the outside, but it becomes a place where it is surrounded and cut off and under siege by Charleston. So as Southern states seceded, it's important to know that the military bases within the South, so say there's a military fort inside Georgia, that would be taken over by the state of Georgia. And usually this was, I mean, almost 99% of the time this was done without any resistance. Most of the forts were actually stationed by a handful of soldiers, or they were stationed by the state militias anyways, and those people from the state were, hear that? That's a motorcycle breaking the law. Do you hear that? That was loud. So anyways, they were stationed by soldiers from the state usually, or maybe a handful of soldiers that weren't going to put up a fight, you know, should push come to shove. So all forts within South Carolina had been retaken by the South Carolina militia, except for one. The one fort that was not retaken is one fort that was on an island, and that island was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter lay in the middle of Charleston Harbor, so it was kind of by itself. And I'll show you in a map in a minute that shows, you know, the forts were all supposed to work together. There was all these forts kind of surrounding Fort Sumter and then Fort Sumter in the middle. So if any boat was to sail in, it would just get totally attacked by all these forts working together. Problem is that Fort Sumter is now a Union-held fort, and all the other forts that surround Fort Sumter are Confederate forts. So Fort Sumter is completely surrounded, and they are now the target for all these guns pointed at them. Union soldiers refused to give up the fort to the South Carolinians, and Lincoln specifically said, do not give up this fort. He told the guy who was in charge of it, a guy by the name of Anderson, his last name was Anderson, he said, do not surrender the fort. Hold out, wait it out. Let's see what happens, because he's being strategic. He knows what he's doing. He knew that if Jefferson Davis made the wrong decision, it could cost him. So he wants Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, to make a difficult decision. The decision is this: if Davis allowed the soldiers to stay, it would make him and his new government invalid. It would make him weak, right? It would say, how strong are you? You've got this fort, and the fort, you told to surrender, and the fort said no. What are you going to do? You've got to make a decision. So he's got to show his authority. He's got to show that he's strong, that he's willing to mean business. But Jefferson Davis also knows this little tightrope he's walking. If he shows his authority, if he attacks the fort, then what's going to happen? Can you think of maybe the issue there? Now he is the guy who attacked first. And Jefferson Davis knows this. He does not want to be the first guy who attacks first, because if he's the first guy who attacks, then it looks like they started the war, and they don't want that. They have this idea that they're peacefully leaving the Union, that they're doing this because they have the right to do this, that they're doing this because it's their God-given, whatever, their God-given right, their God-given, entitlement. So they don't want to attack first. Lincoln knows this. Lincoln says, you're going to have to attack first, or else we're not leaving, buddy. Like, we're staying right here in place, and you're going to look like a weak leader. So if Davis attacks the fort, he would risk being the one who provoked the war and attack first, and he didn't want to do that. So finally, April 12th, 1861, Southern forces open fire on Fort Sumter. The surrounding forts all open up their guns. They start shooting their cannons. 2 days worth of this firing, 2 days of guns being shot at this cannon in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And the Union soldiers there hold out for 2 days, and eventually the Stars and Stripes comes down. The American flag comes down from the flagpole, and the Union soldiers surrender, and up goes the Stars and Bars. Now, the Stars and Bars is a nickname for the new Confederate flag. Now, it's not the flag that you might be thinking, the Confederate flag, that looks like an X. Wasn't quite in use yet. Stars and Bars actually looks very similar to the American flag. It actually looks almost identical to the current state of Georgia flag. So if you know what the flag of the state of Georgia looks like, it's almost identical to the original Confederate flag, or the original flag of the Confederacy. So Lincoln calls for 75,000 men to join up with the army to put down this rebellion. And Lincoln uses this as a propaganda tool. He's going to say, look what happened. Look what the South did. The South fired on us. The South provoked this war. They are terrorists. They're fighting. They're shooting on Old Glory. I mean, look, they're shooting at the Stars and Stripes. Now, believe it or not, the American flag can have a large impact on people, right? I mean, the American flag is a symbol of a lot of things. It's a symbol of the country, of the founding fathers, of, the military, of, your hopes and dreams, and all these kind of things, family and God and baseball and apple pie and all these things. And the idea that the South is going to be firing at the United States military, firing at the flag of the United States, it evokes an emotional response from the North. And what Lincoln knows is he's going to use this to his advantage. He's going to take that flag that was tattered and ratty, that was in Fort Sumter, that got cut all up and blown all up, and he's going to take that flag, he's going to put it right in the middle of New York. He puts it right in the middle of New York City, with the largest city in the country at the time. And he says, look what these people did. Look what these terrorists, these rebels, these attackers, look what they did to our flag. He calls for 75,000 men. He gets 500,000 within a month. So the response is huge, right? The response is massive from men of the North, and they are willing to go fight and die to go put down this rebellion, to force the South back into the Union. And one of the main points, and again, one of the main rallying points from the North was not this idea that they would be going to get rid of slavery, to go free the slaves. The main rallying cry, the main thing that got Northerners to join up, was to preserve the Union, to save the United States, to save the country and the Union, and force these Southern rebels back into the country to preserve the Union. So that was the big motivation for the Northerners. The Southerners usually, their motivation for fighting was to preserve or protect their homes, to protect their land, to protect their states, to preserve their rights. Their narrative was, their story was that they were being unfairly treated, and in their minds, maybe a lot of these soldiers, actually the majority of the soldiers in the South, did not own slaves. So in many of their minds, they were doing this to protect their homes, protect their families, protect their rights. But in reality, the people who were in charge of this whole thing, the guys who were causing this all to go, were all slave owners, and they were very much involved in the idea of preserving those slaves. So Lincoln then called for a blockade of all southern ports. This is called the Anaconda Plan. That's important. That will be on the test. The Anaconda Plan, because what does the anaconda do? It constricts, right? It squeezes its prey until it dies, right? So the idea is the Union, the North had a navy. It had the United States Navy, and the South did not. The South didn't have a bunch of warships. They didn't have a bunch of boats. So they knew that the South relied on foreign support, European support, trading with Europe, to get most of their goods. Not only weapons, not only clothing, not only goods and supplies, but also food. The South, being agricultural, actually the South did not produce that much food. Most Southerners were subsistence farmers, but they did not mostly produce food as a cash crop. Mostly they were producing cotton and tobacco. Can't eat cotton and tobacco, right? And you might say, well, if they were producing cotton, then why were they worried about clothing? Well, they actually didn't have that many factories. They had cotton, but most of the clothing was made in the North. The cotton was sent to the North to be made into clothing. So they had a lot of raw materials, but it actually, in the long run, it wasn't going to benefit the South. The North actually had more food, more factories, more railroads, more men, more everything. And the Civil War at this point, Fort Sumter is the kind of cataclysm, the big moment where the Civil War begins. And that's the famous thing, right? Fort Sumter is the beginning of the Civil War. Know that. That's the answer on the test when you're asked. The beginning of the Civil War, Fort Sumter. So let's keep going. So this is a picture of Charleston Harbor. So you can see downtown Charleston is right here. And then you've got all these red squares in here. These were all batteries, and batteries were areas that are kind of like half forts. They're like fortified towards the coast, but they've got guns all over them. The biggest thing is they've got guns pointing at the sea. So the idea was, if a ship sailed in, let's say, we're at war with another country, and a ship sails in to attack Charleston, all of these batteries, all these guns would be firing at that ship. And Fort Sumter was one of these batteries. It would be in the middle firing as well. Well, here's what happens. All of these become Confederate forts, and the only fort left in the Union's hands at the time is this one right here. So all the guns, instead of being pointed at a ship, are pointed here at Fort Sumter. And they're going to lay into Fort Sumter for 2 days. They're going to attempt to be resupplied, by the Star of the West, which was a ship. They start shooting at it, and of course, it turns around and leaves. Many of the soldiers actually firing on Fort Sumter were students. They were students at the South Carolina Military Academy, known as the Citadel, which is still a prestigious military academy to this day. The Citadel, maybe you've heard of it. I had a friend that went there. This is what it looked like before the battle. It's a little cutaway here. It would have been covered up. They're just showing you, they would have had, if they were fully stocked and fully loaded, they would have had 2 sets of cannons all the way around the fort. It would have been an absolutely massive, very fortified fortress. The entire island was made into this giant fort. And so that's what it looked like before the battle. And this is what it looks like after the battle. This is an actual photograph of the fortress. It is decimated after 2 days of being shot at, being blown up. And believe it or not, there is only 2 casualties. Can you believe that? 2 people were killed in the Battle of Fort Sumter. 1 person died at the end when something exploded and collapsed on him, and the other casualty was actually a mule. So there you go. 1 human casualty, 2 casualties altogether. A mule was blown up. R.I.P. mule. He's looking down on us right now, smiling at us, saying, they talked about me in that history class. So the Civil War, anyways, I'm just kidding. Mules don't go to heaven. Border states. So I'm just kidding. I didn't mean to set you off if you're a mule lover. So let's talk about the border states. We talked about this in the last video. Slave states that did not secede and stayed in the Union were Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. These states, slavery was legal, but they did not leave the Union. They did not secede. They did not join the Confederacy. So they stayed in the Union through the war, and they continued to have slaves until the end of the war. So these were 4 slave states that stayed in the Union. It's important to know. People forget about these 4. West Virginia also could be considered a border state because it breaks away from Virginia and joins the Union as a free state as well. Most of the people in Western Virginia at the time did not own slaves and did not want to go to war because wealthy planters in the eastern side of Virginia were taking the entire state with them to war. So Western Virginians said, the heck with that, we're going to break away and form our own state. And they did. And they joined the Union in 1861, maybe 1862. And they called it West Virginia because they're really, really great at naming things, right? They could have come up with any name in the world, but they chose West Virginia. Okay, sounds like the way Georgia names things, right? So the Civil War, when it was all said and done, cost 600, some people say 700,000 lives. 400,000 were wounded over 4 years. So, just a massive number of people, 600, 700,000 people. Scholars kind of debate how many people exactly died in the Civil War, and 400,000 were wounded. So massive numbers. And again, you have to count both sides numbers. That's the kind of thing that kind of skews the statistics, I guess. But still, it is a true statistic, is that many people died. Now that's just soldiers. That's just soldiers. That's not telling you how many people died at the home front because of starvation, because of civilians that were killed, civilians that died because of starvation or lack of clean drinking water or lack of medicine or lack of whatever. And people who were on the home front, people who lived, during the Civil War that weren't even soldiers, many of them suffered as well. 25,000 went off to fight in 1861. So when the first group of soldiers gets called up to fight during the Civil War, 25,000 join. And by the end of the Civil War, the exact same number would die from Georgia. How awful is that? So South was terribly undersupplied. There were not enough uniforms. There was not enough food. There was not enough weapons. Most soldiers supplied their own weapons. Most soldiers supplied their own clothing. Some of them have uniforms. Early on in the war, most of them had uniforms, or a lot of them had uniforms, but usually the uniforms were tattered and ragged into the first or second year of the war. Most of them didn't have boots or shoes of any kind. The Southerners really during the war looked very ragged. The Northerners had great supply trains. They had great resupplies. Sometimes, actually, believe it or not, some Southerners would leave the Confederacy and go fight and join the Union just so that they could get a decent meal and a jacket and some shoes. So, Southerners, were terribly undersupplied. But still they persisted throughout the war. Still they fought and won many battles. I mean, you can't take away the fact that the South did win a lot of battles in the war. That can't be, taken away. Major Georgia cities like Macon, Augusta, Columbus, Savannah, and Atlanta helped to supply the South during the war. Not only just Georgia, but these major cities. Georgia had some of the larger cities in the South. During the Civil War. Remember, the South was very agrarian, very rural. So Georgia was known as kind of like the breadbasket or the workshop of the Confederacy. Atlanta was called because they did have some factories in those cities where things could be produced. The Confederate government was the first to call a draft in U.S. history. This is the first time that in the U.S. history that soldiers are chosen or told that they have to come serve, regardless of whether they want to or not. This is a big step. American armies before this had been completely staffed and made up of soldiers who volunteered. There's a lot of national pride in the idea that you volunteer. American armies are made up of volunteers. And this is the first time in U.S. history where soldiers are told you must go fight. You don't have a choice. Governor Brown and Jefferson Davis disagreed about the draft. And many other issues, and this caused loyalty problems. Brown usually tended to think of Georgia first and the Confederacy second, which go figure, right? I mean, we've been talking up to this point, the South was all about factionalism and the idea of a state's individual rights. And then when they all secede, they are not willing to help each other out because they're too busy worried about themselves, right? I mean, it's like, who didn't see this coming? Not to be surprised by that by any means. So the first battle of the war actually takes place during the summertime. It's the first battle of Bull Run. It's in Virginia, and it is a Confederate victory. You need to know that. That takes place in Virginia. The South wins that battle, a decisive battle. It's a very odd battle, too, because everyone's really excited about war at the time. Everyone thinks that it's going to be this glorious, wonderful, lovely kind of escapade. And unfortunately, it's a very bloody, terrible affair. A lot of people actually show up outside of Bull Run, and they intend to watch the battle with picnic baskets and blankets and all, and they put them out on the lawn like they're going to watch a spectator sport, like a football game or something like that. And these soldiers start marching up and firing at each other, and very quickly people see the horrors of war. The Confederates won many battles early on. But the strength of Northern numbers eventually wears them down. The North has better supplies. They have better numbers. The one thing that the South did have was better generals for the most part. Early on in the war, most of the Northern generals seemed to show themselves as pretty incompetent. They didn't really know what they were doing. They weren't very good at leading. They weren't very good at making decisions. And the South actually had a lot of generals who were really smart and made great decisions and were some of the leading generals of the American military before, but they all left and joined the Confederacy because they were all from the South. So many of the South, many of the nation's best generals actually went with the South, joined the Confederacy. 120,000 Georgians fought in the Civil War. 25,000 died. And again, that's the same number as the amount of soldiers that went off to war in the first year from Georgia. So let's talk about life during the war. So life during the war for women, was pretty rough. We've talked about before, women's status, women's role was very much to, work alongside a husband, to have a status that is connected with a husband, and the husband goes off to fight. And many of those husbands never returned. So this really caused a lot of problems for a lot of the women. They had to find a way to make ends meet to survive. If the army didn't have enough food, like we just said, if the army didn't have enough supplies, surely then the civilians definitely did not, right? They definitely didn't have enough food or water or clothing or whatever. Many women and children fought starvation throughout the war. Many women and children struggled. And life for most slaves, they mostly remained unchanged. Production of cotton continued through the war. If you were a planter, actually, you were exempt from the draft, which the ultimate irony and these hypocrites, these guys who were the ones who got Georgia into this war, were not willing, by and large, were not willing to go fight for it. They were exempt from the draft if they had over 20 slaves. So just how infuriating is that? They're making the guys who had no say in this go fight in their place. Runaways became more common during the war, actually, because they weren't really able to police this. Many slaves were able to escape. Many slaves were able to fight being enslaved during the war much more easily because there weren't as many people there to stop them. Some slaves were taken with their masters. This is important to note. There were slaves that went off to war with the Confederates. Now, it almost never, and I'll repeat that, almost never did they fight as combative roles, meaning they almost never were given a gun and told to shoot at the Union. And there's a couple reasons why. Number one, there was this deep entrenched idea that slaves were intrinsically, they were cowards, right? That they were, by definition, they wouldn't follow orders in war. They were cowards, that they were unable to be brave or heroic or anything like that. And then again, this all goes in with this kind of built-in racism that had been built during this time. And they also, just from an obvious perspective, they weren't willing to give their slave a gun because they knew that they might use that gun against them. Now, many of these slaves had very deep relationships with the masters. That's important to note too. So, a lot of these guys, a lot of these slaves, they had deep, important relationships with the masters. But at the end of the day, they were still their slaves. Who doesn't want freedom if it's offered? It doesn't matter how well you know somebody or how much, how close to somebody you are. If you're their slave, that's different. So the Battle of Antietam early on in the war is the bloodiest single day of battle in U.S. history. It takes place in Maryland. It takes place, Robert E. Lee invades the North. It is basically a draw, but it comes off more as a Northern victory because the South retreats after the battle. They go back into Virginia. So in a way, it's a Northern victory. After the battle, Lincoln announces this thing called the Emancipation Proclamation. This is important to know. The Emancipation Proclamation frees the slaves. Now, where does it free the slaves? It frees the slaves in the Confederacy. So if you were a slave in Kentucky, were you free now? No, you were not. Kentucky was a border state. It was in the Union. If you were a slave and you were in Maryland, are you free now? No. Missouri? No. Virginia? Actually, no. So here's the funny thing about the Emancipation Proclamation. It said that slaves in states that had seceded were now free. But those states that had seceded obviously were not going to listen to something that Lincoln said. So how is it important? Well, it encourages slaves to run away. It encourages slaves to resist. And also it encourages slaves, once the Union Army comes into those places, once they liberate those places where the South was, or in the South, those slaves were then freed. It was a military maneuver. It was a tactic used by the North in order to undermine the South, also to keep Europe out of the war. Great Britain and France actually were looking at and interested in helping the South out, helping out the Confederacy during the war. The Emancipation Proclamation keeps them out of it. It basically encourages them, hey, if you want to come fight, this war is about slavery now, officially, and if you join, you're helping fight for a cause that you disagree with, because Great Britain and France also had already outlawed slavery. So they weren't willing to, and after that, Great Britain and France basically break off any idea that they might come and help the South. So this, again, Emancipation Proclamation, this said that all persons held in slavery in the Confederacy were hereby freed. You need to know about that. That is important for the test. This caused slaves to be freed as Union forces took over areas with plantations. It also caused many slaves to simply run away and join their masters. It did not free slaves in the border states. That's important to know. If you were a slave in Kentucky, you are out of luck. It also allowed, this is the important part too, though. It also had a provision that said Black people could join the U.S. military. Black people can join the Union Army. And that was unheard of before then. Black people had never been able to join the military before the Emancipation Proclamation. So I'm going to stop there for today. And you can watch this video tomorrow. It's getting dark on me, as you can see, as I'm sitting out here on my porch, drinking my grape soda. It's got dark, but it's not going to storm tonight, which is good because, again, that storm was scary the other night. And yeah, you can barely focus on me because the lighting is so poor. Anyways, so look forward to some questions coming up. This is a long chapter, a lot of stuff. We're making our way through it though, making our way through the year. I miss you guys. Golly, it's crazy. We need to do another Zoom meeting. We need to do another Zoom meetup so we can see each other's smiling faces. You guys are going to be high schoolers before you know it. Isn't that crazy? The year's winding down. I miss you guys. I love you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Peace. Bye.